Welcome to Constitution Arguments. I'm John Rogers, here to present today's episode, Our Democracy, the Eternal Compromise. In this episode, we will be taking a look at the document on which all of our arguments in this series have been based on, the US Constitution, or more precisely, the intentions and motives of the framers of the Constitution, as well as its impact on the world today. The Constitution's writing process was less than ideal. In fact, the Constitution was written behind closed doors and by an exclusive group of elite men who certainly weren't representative of the country as a whole. Many of the framers even owned slaves. And even after the secret conventional process, they offered the people of America little to no way to significantly alter the contents of the document before ratification. To learn more about the motivations of the framers and the implications of the Constitution, we're going to pay a visit to Christina Murray, an internationally esteemed constitutional historian and professor of constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. Here we are in beautiful Cape Town, joined by Christina Murray, whom we will certainly learn a lot from today. Thanks for joining us, Christina.
Absolutely. I've helped draft many constitutions, some of which are in effect today, and I'm always amazed by the influence of the US Constitution. Nearly every democratic government formed after the United States has been inspired by that document. It's astounding.
I don't think anyone could contest that. But today, rather than discussing the global implications of the American Constitution, I'd like to discuss the factors that influenced its creation. I did some research in preparation for this interview, and from what I found, the Constitution appears to be a clever scheme created by a greedy group of elites. It's a stretch to call it democratic.
What sources have you been reading? Sure, the document isn't perfect, but I don't think it's as bad as you believe.
Well, I began by reading some of Halton's work.
It's interesting stuff.
Do you agree with him that the framers intentionally divided the power of the voting people among the branches of government so the elite could control society? I think it's a pretty convincing argument, especially when you consider the public opinion insulated Senate.
Look, the framers definitely did not create a complete democracy, but they had to make compromises. Consider the status of slavery, for example. If the framers explicitly condemned or promoted slavery in the Constitution, half of the states wouldn't have ratified it. Similarly, the Senate wasn't democratic, but it did give less populous states a compelling reason to ratify the Constitution.
I guess that is true, but the compromises that you're talking about directly benefited the framers. All of them were from the upper classes of society, and many of them were slave owners, who must have been quite content during the Importation Clause, which banned Congress from regulating the international slave trade for 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. And the Senate itself, it was intended to allow the elite to exert undemocratic power over the rest of the country. Madison himself, the father of the US Constitution, said privately that the policy of divide et impera, literally divide and conquer, was, quote, the only policy by which a republic can be administered.
I think you're missing an important attribute of the Constitution. It's ridiculous to expect the original document to hold up to today's standards. And the framers predicted that. Of course, they created a constitution that put rich white landowners in charge, and that's just how the world worked back then. But they also created a constitution that can change with time, and it has. Think about the amendment process, for example. Thanks to the 17th Amendment, senators are now elected by the people. That's not what the framers had in mind for themselves, but they let that decision lay with people in a future generation, and I think that's a victory.
I would agree that may well be a victory, but at the same time, how can you defend a system that enabled the national government, right after the Constitution's ratification, to force in-debt farmers to pay up, even though they'd been unjustly exploited by wealthy creditors?
Well, even if that action did favor the rich, it was necessary. If the federal government didn't have and strictly use the power to enforce economic regulations, Americans would have been left unable to deal with the tyranny of state factions, unable to trade fairly within the United States, and unable to protect themselves from rampant pirates or hostile nations at their borders. And remember, even while the Constitution enables the government to sufficiently protect and regulate at a large scale, the Bill of Rights restricts the power of the national government, limiting it to these beneficial uses to protect the American people from exploitation.
That is a great point. But I still can't get over the moral validity of the Constitution. I find it hard to praise a group of rich, white slave owners for creating a government to their own benefit. The original document seems dishonest to me. It was a government by the rich for the rich. The guys locked themselves in a room to write the Constitution. That is the opposite of what a democracy should be.
It sounds like you've been reading some Charles Beard, and I deeply respect his work. In fact, I read it to my children whenever they can't sleep.
His writing certainly is versatile.
Anyway, I feel the need to remind you that the Constitution was designed to change. As John Roche once said, commerce was commerce, and if different interpretations of the word arose, later generations could worry about that problem of definition. The initial document was intentionally vague and malleable, but those are two of its greatest strengths. The framers weren't entirely admirable, but they managed to create a government that satisfied the states with the Senate, satisfied the people with the House of Representatives and the Bill of Rights, and it was insulated from factionalization by the Supreme Court. You have to admit, the Constitution was a brilliant compromise.
I guess it was. Even if the framers weren't as democratic as we are now, they did let us control the Constitution's effect, and it really has evolved to match the modern political sentiment.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Alright, thank you for your time and explanations. This has been Constitutional Arguments with your host, John Rogers. Thank you for watching and goodbye.